So I'm really delighted to introduce our speakers today. We have two great speakers presenting their work. Firstly, it's Dr. Siobhan Campbell, who's a senior lecturer in creative writing here at the Open University. She's worked to develop creative and expressive writing methodologies with partners in Iraq, Lebanon, and Northern Ireland. She's co-author of the Expressive Writing Handbook for Human Rights Defenders and Frontline Workers, and she's currently reporting on the AHRC-funded project Expressive Writing and Telling in Crisis, addressing urgent needs in Akka Governorate, Lebanon. Our second speaker is Dr. Sally Blackburn-Daniels, who's recently started her new role at Teesside University as a research fellow at the Centre for Culture and Creativity. She's also a visiting fellow here at the Open University with current research interests in empathy, metaphor, and creative practices. She was the impact consultant for English, creative writing, and religious studies for the 2021 REF, and she's worked with Siobhan on creative writing with frontline healthcare workers in COVID, and with Dr. Shaf Tawheed on the Read It project, as well as being a key researcher on the Expressive Writing in Crisis Lebanon project. And I also want to just congratulate Siobhan and Sally as well, because they are the winners of the COVID-19 category of this year's Open University Research Excellence Awards. So I'll hand over now to Siobhan and Sally to start their presentation, and you'll be speaking for the first part of this seminar. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks to everybody who's here. I'm Siobhan, and I'll kick things off, and then Sally will come in. But before we begin the sort of meat of the seminar, we wanted to introduce you to some of the voices of the people we've been working with in Lebanon, and just to note in a way that it's important their voices get an airing. And I think Heidi is just about to share a small film which the women have made, and it'll speak for itself, I think.
لأول مرة بلبنان نفذت شبكة عكار للتنمية بالتعاون مع جامعة كينغستون منهاج الكتابة التعبيرية مع مجموعة من السيدات يلي تعرضوا لصدمات بحياتهم بمنطقة السهل. هذا الفيديو رح يكون عم بيعرض لكم التأثير الإيجابي من بعد هذه المشاركة.
أحكي لكم القصة الثانية كتبتها عن أمي، عن كتابة رسالة لم تكتب. عزيزتي أمي، كم أشتاق لك في حضورك وفي غيابك، لأنك نبع من الحنان، لأنك لم تتركيني في يوم من الأيام، لأن الجنة تحت أقدام الأمهات. كتبت هذه الرسالة لك يا أعظم أم في الدنيا، لأنك عندما سافرت تركت فراغا كبيرا في حياتي، وأشكرك كثيرا لأنك تعبت علي في دراستي، خليتني أدرس وأتعلم ويصير عندي شهادة. وأنا أقول لك كم أنا فخورة بك، لأنك أمي والغالية على قلبي كتير، لأنك أنت نور دربي التي توجهني إلى الطريق الصحيح. أحبك كثيرا.
أنا اليوم حبيت أعبر لكم عن مشاركتي بمنهاج الكتابة التعبيرية، وحبيت أحكي عن تمرين نافذة على النفس. قصتي اليوم لا أعرف من أين أبدأ وماذا أقول. هل الحياة كلها صعبة ومؤلمة؟ بدي أقول هالرسالة لابني. عزيزي ابني، أتمنى لو كان عندي مال لأبني لك بيت، وأتمنى أن تكون من الأوائل في الدراسة، وأتمنى لك السعادة مدى الحياة يا عمري، وأتمنى لك طول العمر يا حبيبي. وتشجعت ودخلت في هذه الجمعية، وشعرت بالراحة، وتخطيت الألم الذي كان في داخلي، وتشجعت على الكتابة التعبيرية عبرت عن أشياء حدثت معي لم أكن أعبر عنها سابقا، وأشكر كل العاملين على هذا المشروع. أنا تشجعت ودخلت هالجمعية، شاركت بهالجمعية اللي ساعدتني عن الكتابة التعبيرية، وأنا ما كنت أكتب لي فترة طويلة تاركة المدرسة، وهلأ تحسنت كتابتي وصرت أكتب وعبر عن حياتي وعن قصصي وعن كل شيء بداخلي. وأنا بشكر الصبايا يلي ساعدوني، وبشكر شبكة عكار للتنمية.
Siobhan, you're muted currently.
Yes, that would help. I was just saying it never fails to move me when I see this film. And in a way, those are the voices that we value in the work that we do. But I suppose you could say one of the very first ethical questions is, you know, how to hold it together when you're hearing about other people's lives, the intimate details of their lives. And what we found was if one of us was being strong, the other one could be in tears and vice versa. But enough of that for now, and we will return to that later. So we have a bit of a PowerPoint for you. I think you could upload that, Sally. Thank you. And it's not going to be death by PowerPoint, hopefully. We will try to speak to the slides, although occasionally I will read from them. Just a couple of pictures there of the kind of inclusive collegial work that we do, all wearing masks, of course, as a lot of this work was in COVID, and you'll hear more about that. So we'll carry on from there. Thanks, Sally. So expressive writing and telling is, we think, an agile, low-cost, inclusive tool, and there's a handbook in various languages available. Basically, it provides pathways which are of increasing challenge, increasing difficulty, you could say, depending on how long a convener has with their participants. It provides exercises, workshop plans. It talks about counter indicators, things to watch out for as conveners, and gives case studies. And the initial one was co-developed in the co-research way that we'll be speaking about with partners in Kirkuk, but it has gone through several iterations, and you'll see why as we continue speaking. Every situation is, of course, different. So we call it an adaptable humanities-based resource, and it's been the basis for training programs for human rights defenders and social workers in Iraq, Lebanon, and the UK. And the three notes there are what the ICS story, so the impact case study, very ably helped and put together by Sally, has noted. So it has got, if you like, different sort of arms, different legs to it. And we'll talk more about that as we continue. Next slide, thank you. So just as a little bit of background, I've done this work over a couple of decades, learning how to do it as I was doing it. It's very much seat of the pants work. In other words, you really are learning as you're doing. Usually I'm embedded in a situation where there are psychologists present and those who can monitor the quite delicate situations and who can use their own governance for protecting the vulnerable participants if the participants are vulnerable. So partners included Participation and Practice of Rights in Northern Ireland, a number of veterans organisations, including Combat Stress UK, and then more recently, several different non-governmental organisations, in particular ACAR Network for Development, AND, who we'll be speaking about today. The slight weirdness about AND is when you see it written down, you tend to read and. So forgive me if I still make that mistake, even though I've had this for several years. Thanks, Sally. So expressive life writing and telling, by the way, the telling is where writing is counterindicated, and it's not necessarily where people are not literate or anything like that. It's often where people prefer to sort of speak orally and have it transcribed by a workshop convener. And so we added on the telling. Again, we developed the telling aspect in conjunction with our partners in Kirkuk at the time. So it emerges from the creative writing discipline, and in this talk, CW with capitals stands for the discipline of creative writing as it's been developed in the academy. So it's not creative writing with small c, small or, small w, as in sort of a hobbyist. It's got a disciplinary structure. It has inbuilt, you know, critical apparatus, etc. So part of that is the workshop, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But a couple of key terms that we have found useful and will appear in this seminar. Participatory action research is an approach to research in communities that emphasizes participation and action. And it seeks to understand the world by trying to change it collaboratively and allowing for reflection. That's very important, the self-reflexive process. Again, that's very important in creative writing, so it immediately made sense to us. So PAR emphasizes collective inquiry and experimentation grounded in experience. And we could say possibly that we're doing PAAR, participatory arts action research, but I'm not sure that'll catch on, we'll see. We're also using the term co-research, and you'll know more about this than I do, but we have found this useful because it reminds us we're doing research with or by recipients rather than to, about, or for them. And terms like emancipatory and inclusive are used also, but we prefer participatory, as that links with participatory action research, which has the involvement of participating communities at its core. It acknowledges the participants' place in the process of knowledge production, and it also links back to the tenets of creative writing as a discipline. Next slide. So, as you can imagine, EWT for short recognizes the primacy of personal experience, and it provides pathways for the sharing of that as a form of knowledge. So there's a social learning aspect, which is key. Again, that comes straight out of creative writing. As Maria Swans observes, participation and action make research contextual. When the roles of researchers and the researched interchange across a research project, a mutual development of knowledge can take place. I suppose you could say that's the ideal situation. What you'll hear today are the challenges and the difficulties and the visual sense of how you try and make that practical. And in a sense, trying to make that practical, you're beginning to answer some of the ethical questions around it. Thanks, Sally. So I just wanted to show you a workshop. They don't all look like this, but this is a particular one, just to say that the idea of workshop in creative writing, you could say is in a way quite a radical equality generating moment. If I have a visitor from higher up in an organization in my workshop who isn't normally a participant, and they do like to come and observe, I will always require them to join in. So they too are facing the blank page and the exercises we're doing that day. And I do meet resistance to that, but that's I insist upon. Because the workshop is for everybody in the room to be in a safe place, a place where what you say or write cannot be wrong. Whatever you write is correct, is perfect, is what you're doing at this moment. And also it's a safe place to share work. It's a place where things are becoming, they haven't already become. And that again comes out of creative writing, where draft work obviously is shared in workshops up and down the land. But it's actually quite a profound and potentially radical equalizing moment. And I know that our partners have appreciated, you know, the kind of apparently simple but actually quite serious sort of impact that being in workshop together with all of us trying to do the same thing, and some of us doing it better than others, as always, has had. So, next slide. Thank you. So what have we found? Over the period of developing the Expressive Life Writing and Telling handbook and the other outputs from the most recent project, which we'll speak about, we have noticed some key things, including relationship building, which allows adaptive change, capacity building, and that includes capacity among the researchers, learning to learn, and self-reflection on the learning. Allowing both those things to happen and recognizing them both as forms of knowledge is an ethical way of recognition. And obviously then creative expression, where individual experience in particular is valued. So iterative practice is at the heart of this work. We don't get it right the first time. When we go to a new situation, we obviously do needs assessment and we work out what's going to happen in this particular situation. And we have a workshop to work on that. And before we get to the workshops, one might imagine we'd be having. So there's a lot of pre-work to make this sort of operative. And it's extremely relational because of the input from the people we're working with at all times. So I should mention Meg Jensen, who's not here today, but she has been a partner researcher, and with myself, she's developed responses to post-conflict recovery, peace building, providing participatory practice and self-reflective frameworks. We've trained fellows from Gulf Cooperation nations with the John Smith Memorial Trust. And then iteratively, we developed the materials and we worked with Iraqi rights activists and more recently with Lebanese social workers and their recipients, who are mainly, but not exclusively, Syrian refugees. So Sally and myself are mainly concentrating on the period of this substantial AHRC grant that we received under the Global Challenges Research Fund. And we used it to explore the ethical and practical challenges in the use of expressive writing in crisis. We didn't think that expressive writing and telling would have any place in crisis. Because we presumed things like not being able to go to your office, lack of electricity, being under a COVID lockdown, etc., might preempt that. But we were told by our partners that no, in fact, psychosocial supports are even more important in crisis, and continuity of approach, even if that approach then has to be adapted for crisis, which of course it did. And Sally will talk to you more about the adaptations. We learned that our initial idea was wrong, and in a sense, one of the assumptions maybe that researchers make. There still was a place, that place had to be different. So with ACAR Network, we've developed an online version, a WhatsApp version of our curriculum. Again, things we never thought would work. I mean, if you had told me 5 years ago I'd be doing a WhatsApp version of Expressive Life Writing and Telling, I just would not have believed you. And you'll hear more about those adaptations, as I say. Next slide. Thank you. So there's a bottom-up sort of radical equality, which I've mentioned, which emanates from the idea of the workshop, but also emanates from ideas in co-research. And what it can mean is that the usual power structures and constraints that we all work under may be undone or sidelined. We all know what it's like to work in funded research, where your home institution has certain requirements. The national funder, in our case AHRC, has other types of requirements. There's going to be, down the line, requirements for outputs to look in a certain way. And all of these things do feed in. And that's just from our side. The amount of the time, effort, energy, and expertise that our partners have given just was utterly humbling for us in terms of how they were able to work within the constraints they were under, And obviously they are also funded, so they are also answering to funders. But what we hoped was, and I think we can say that this is the case, that once you get people together to do something creative like expressive writing and telling in a workshop situation, a lot of those, not all of them, but a lot of those power hierarchy constraints, power structures do feel like they're sidelined. I hope it's not an illusion. I think it's true. But it's certainly something we have felt. So our analysis, oops, sorry, just go back for one. Thank you. Thanks. Our analysis highlights the different ways in which working in crisis put pressure on the phases of practice. And we try and identify the ethical, methodological, and practical challenges, and Sally will talk about those. We did find becoming clear about our collaborators as co-researchers led to us understanding different kinds of pathways for improving and extending the co-research, and also for developing diversified structures of involvement, and in the end, very different outputs than we maybe had thought we would produce in the beginning. So co-research does aim to put the ethical aims of agency and empowerment into practice. Reflection on the process is key. The approach challenges the usual power relations as it values local expertise, knowledge, and lived experience. I'll give you some references later. Thanks, Sally. Thank you. So just a little bit about ACAR Network for Development. They are in ACAR, which is in the north of Lebanon. They work with about 15,000 women, including 7,000, and actually more than that now, Syrian refugees. And one of the developments as part of this project was that the social workers and activists themselves realized they could employ expressive writing and the program for themselves as well as for their end beneficiaries. So we, of course, followed that lead, and we had workshops with them for them to reflect on their own organisational practice and supports. And the director of AND, Nadine Saba, who is a truly wonderful human being, sat there listening to quite a lot of feedback emerging through the expressive writing and telling about better ways of doing things, better ways of organising, and most importantly, how the social workers had understood expressive writing and telling to be a potential tool in adding a qualitative approach to their initial interviews with their clients. So they really understood story as a narrative, if you like, as a potential door-opening possibility when speaking to women. It's mainly women they deal with, although not exclusively, but mainly. So the work by the social workers in their own workshops led to new understandings of how this tool could be used, and they then changed their interview template to allow for more open-ended type questions, allowing for more story-based knowledge or data, if you like, but it visually felt different to them, and they eventually decided that actually they were getting much more through that about gender-based violence and domestic violence. So they really felt then this is an excellent tool, and they helped us work out ways to embed that, which we did in the end. So as AND's director says, that's Nadine Saba, the impact of the exercises has been visible on both the social workers, who are themselves survivors of conflict zones, and on the participants. And I suppose that's again something we learned. We were not necessarily considering the social workers as participants themselves, but they immediately saw that they were. and of course makes perfect sense. We did, of course, have to do all the usual metrics, questionnaires, and so on. And the surveyed social workers agreed that specified writing and telling could change their practice, would change their practice. And as a result of them becoming trained in the methods, 240 of AND's clients, mainly Syrian refugees, now come regularly to the ELW sessions. And some of them have used the materials of the programme to create workshops in their own outlying areas. And follow-up monitoring does seem to imply an effect of increased resilience and capacity. We're very wary of, particularly of the word resilience, but when we're given it by others, we record it. We can talk about that later. There's a couple of quotes from participants there. I think we may have had them in the film. And they're there because, again, we feel the actual voices of the end beneficiaries, if you like, are important to continue to encounter. Thanks, Sally. So just trying to think about the key outcomes of co-research. We find co-research where you essentially realize that we're all researchers together. We find that the outcomes are unexpected, potentially, that they require adaptation, and that sharing them is part of the knowledge generation. So again, it's the reflection on the process, and process is key, obviously, as you've been hearing, to all of this. So for the NGO, as I mentioned, they were able to use ELW to begin hearing more about GBV from the women they work with. They felt it enabled the next stages of support and even possible juridical action. In terms of community, women who've been through the programme went off to create their own groups. They produced pamphlets, they held events, they had an exhibition recently, and they produced that little film you've seen and other items. So they have found that it's a tool that has legs and can go different places in different guises, and that's very interesting to see. Other effects, the uptake of skills-based courses increased in the safe places that AND run. More women came more regularly because they were enjoying the ELWT. And they came more regularly and they began to bring their children with them, which gave the social workers access to the wider families, and they were able to run sort of mini groups for the children while the women were doing their ELWT. And they report that they were able to encourage more children back into education. Having said that, since COVID, the situation has deteriorated even further in Lebanon, and this may not now pertain. We're not entirely up to date with the current disintegration because it's a very fast-moving situation, as you can imagine. Thanks, Sally. So we draw on several thinkers like Martin Buber, Immanuel Kant, and this is probably not to be recorded because the philosophers will be shaking in their shoes. But basically, praxis as the application of theory to cases encountered in experience seems a useful concept for us. Ethically significant thought or practical reason arguably places the practical above the theoretical, but it acknowledges the practical as a way of thinking. And this dovetails back into the creative writing discipline. In that discipline, creative writing itself is considered a way of thinking, so that it is actually critical. Not something everyone who hears the words creative writing knows or understands or even wants to. So in our projects, having to adapt to crisis situation and other pressures, we've learned on the go, as it were, but we've tried to remain ethically aware that there's a set of emerging understandings or a set of ethical recognitions. And that's what we try to ensure underpins our ongoing actions. Thanks, Sally. So I'm just going to tell you about one unexpected sort of parallel outcome, which occurred at the same time as we were working in Lebanon. We had worked in Iraq training 75 social workers, and we'd been part of, I was part of a SIRI, so Support for Integrated Reconciliation in Iraq program run by the UNDP there. So during the period of the AHRC grant, the UNDP Iraq, in cooperation with the Ministry for Internal Affairs, decided that they really needed to get to grips with how the pandemic was affecting women. In particular, they really felt these were stories that they didn't know enough about, so they weren't able to plan in terms of rolling out supports. And so they basically had the social workers contact 2,500 women and girls over 5 governorates. And the key bit where expressive writing practice came in was that they adapted their questions, which previously would have been quite cut and dried and quantitative. They adapted those to allow for what they called story gathering. And the social workers reported that ELW practice enabled the gathering of story, and they're leading to qualitative results. And they also noted that their own sharing of the ongoing remote experience in their own sharing workshops helped to establish a sense of teamwork among the social workers. So a community of practice developed online. And that's the, I suppose, the profound reality of expressive writing and telling, or even of creative writing, is that once you're sharing it, you're actually creating a community of practice. And that's something I think creative writers have known, but this is the work bringing it into different arenas. So it's quite exciting. Next slide, please. So for those who are interested, I won't spend too long on this, but basically the methodology the Iraqis used, they were trying to create a really useful database. So they used a web-based platform. They made initial telephone contact using the Expressive Life Writing and Telling Handbook. They adapted the procedures into exercises. And they hoped that some of the outcomes would be that respondents would join in subsequent online sessions, and they did join in a good percentage. And the social workers also hoped for an improved ability to cope with anxiety and accompanying stress, leading to an improved sense of safety and hope. That was a hoped for outcome, and it's very difficult to quantify that. Did that happen? I don't know, but the report has something to say about that, and I'll come to that now. Next slide. Thank you. So telephone, web chat, and text conversations, social workers putting people at their ease, explaining how their own personal experience would be valued, and there'll be no wrong responses. They wanted really to find out, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected you? So the response from some respondents was, oh, so you actually want to know about me, whereas they're used to any sort of governmental question being, how many children have you got? How many of them are under X number of age? How many are working? How many are not? So they were sort of slightly disarmed, and some of them were quite charmed by the interaction. So we do think the pilot demonstrated that expressive writing and telling methodology can be an element within a multimodal based outreach project, adding to the impact of it. And I mean, the results obviously showed that COVID had a disproportionate impact on women, including financial situations, limited access to healthcare facilities, social services, and obviously the gender inequalities that might be present already were exacerbated during COVID, as we know was essentially worldwide. Next slide, thank you. So just to give you a sense of some of their research questions, the kind of question they were now asking, have you received any support from relatives, in a way elicited a story about actual living. You know, I live alone, I live with my mother-in-law beats me, or whatever. Do you have any family member with disability? What kind of problems do you face when taking care of them? Are you facing any violent acts from a family member? And so the open-endedness of the inquiry meant that actual personal stories were recorded, and our partners in Iraq feel this for them was quite radical. Next slide, thank you. So they report to us that in one case, a woman was dissuaded from a suicide attempt. In others, respondents were moved from where they were residing to a different relative's home where a threat of violence could be avoided. They also reported the women responded positively and talked without fear or anxiety, as if they were in face-to-face interviews. And Sally will talk more about the switch to online, which is something we're all still coming to terms with. I mean, I'm looking at the little white dot, hoping I'm looking at all of you. Those of you who are not there answering your emails. Anyway, social workers were actually surprised at the level of response. They were also taken aback, even though they sort of thought they knew this, but they were taken aback with the number of women and girls exposed to instances of violence. They were able to alert local authorities where appropriate and put in place mitigating situations where they could. So the social workers themselves did endorse the ELW training as useful and expressed their desire for additional similar training to build on their experience in the field. So we may be working with Iraq again. We'll have to see if we can. Next slide, thank you. So I think we probably covered this, but key findings would include what the anxieties were about. So actual stories, stories of trying to find medicines, stories of having to move for various reasons. Family care and housework burdens hugely increased during lockdown. Those who used to go out, obviously for the day, were still in the house all day, putting huge psychological pressure on really everyone. And then school closures had a disproportionate effect on female students at, all through the grade levels. So all of the stories led to actual information, which led to policy being able to be adapted, or so we hear. Next slide. So were there challenges? Yes, of course there were. Not everybody had a private phone. Often, if there is one phone in a family, it's a male family member who controls the phone. Sometimes there's a fear of having the women of the family speaking effectively to the government. Some respondents felt quite scared about speaking openly. Some respondents asked to be contacted by appointment so they could go to a place where they felt safe and they could talk again with openness. And the social workers worked to find ways around this, which is something we also noticed in Lebanon. Having a safe word, being able to shut down the computer quickly, doing online contact at certain times of the day, using WhatsApp sometimes worked because there's a privacy element there, and basically having some other, I suppose, pretenses around the social worker saying to the respondent, just pretend I'm a friend and we will, if anybody comes in that you don't want, just say, oh yes, I'll be able to contact you, we'll have that coffee or whatever. So they gave them ways around it. But no, nonetheless, these challenges persist. Next slide. Other challenges, respondents asking for financial or food aid, even though the purpose of the call is made clear, but you can totally understand why they would. Respondents never having heard of surveys and not wanting to engage, quite understandably. And the social workers themselves, because if you're a social worker, obviously you are there to serve clients, and when the sort of the mammoth task, the sense of overwhelming difficulty is being expressed constantly to you, they felt they had to have their own self-care. So they ran expressive workshops for themselves as an aid in self-care, but also to share best practice with each other. So again, the expressive writing, telling idea permeates through, or back, if you like, to the partnering social workers themselves. Next slide, thank you. So lessons learned. The study helped to reinforce management and research procedures. UNDP feel that they would use these interviewing skills and this interviewing technique in other situations. It helped them, they felt, to understand the complexity of the COVID-19 pandemic and the actual impacts, the real socio-economic impacts. Next slide. And this is a list of what the final report identified as key lessons learned. And I suppose well-framed and well-managed project allowing for a relatively quick response seemed quite important to them, because they needed to roll out, if they could, mitigations to the situations of certain people where they could do. They felt also that the development of a large consolidated database with this kind of qualitative data, let's say, or story, if we want, actually helped them to plan ahead, to make policy for the future, and to, in a way, recognize the voices of those they're actually trying to serve, but they mightn't always recognize. Next slide. A set of recommendations for local NGOs also emerged, which we think does show broader ethical recognitions coming into the picture. And again, we felt that somehow those recommendations were, if you like, still had that little echo or taste of the expressive about them. So although it might be fainter in these, we felt that there was a sense that it also valued those as individuals and not just, if you like, numbers on a data sheet. Next slide, please. So the report that I've mentioned is the Women and Girls in Iraq during COVID-19 pandemic. The Women's Leadership Institute, UNDP, put it together. And they're hoping it could be used regarding policy provisions and preparation for future crises. So, as I say, this was an unexpected adaptation and a set of unexpected potential outcomes regarding ELW. we do retain concerns about the fact that when you're working in a crisis, ethical decisions may become affected by that sense of urgency, that sense we have to do something. Normal patterns of scrutiny might be rushed, or they might even be jettisoned. But we were somewhat reassured by the report itself and by the presence of the WLI and by their own recorded self-reflection on the process, which rather, as always in these situations, adheres to the do no harm directive of the UN. So next slide, please. Thank you. So I just put up some references there, and we can provide those afterwards. Sally will speak about the Lebanese side of the project and the challenges we faced there. And we'll have time for questions afterwards, because there's a lot in this, and we're only in a way trying to draw out certain key themes for you today. So I think we'll be turning to Sally now.
Hi everyone. So as Siobhan explained earlier in the session, I'll be considering the effects of working in crisis and the adaptations developed during crisis, particularly relating to the work with A&D social workers and the research team during the joint analysis workshops. As this project took place during an unprecedented time of national and global upheaval for the researchers, Siobhan's learning by doing approach seemed to be the only approach to take. So during planning for the project, Siobhan and Meg Jensen had planned for 2 short periods of participatory research to take place at the headquarters of NGO A&D in Accra, or potentially in Cyprus. Once the HRC confirmed the award for this research, it became apparent that the developing COVID-19 pandemic may make these joint analysis workshops slightly more complicated to run. In fact, travelling to Lebanon would turn out to be impossible. Okay. So there are some socio-economic challenges that were in the background for us. According to Plan International's multi-sectoral needs assessment, Lebanon has the largest number of refugees per capita, which causes significant pressure on the humanitarian workers and NGOs that we were working with within the country. The needs of refugees and non-governmental organisations is further exacerbated due to the Lebanese currency having lost more than 60% of its value by September 2020. And there was an increase in food prices of up to 367%. So the UN stated that half of Lebanon's population during the period of our participatory research were living below the poverty line. Social Affairs and Tourism Minister said that the 75% of population in Lebanon required aid at the time. So, and also, as we heard from Siobhan, Lebanon is a key strategic area for funding grassroots organisations that tackle the shadow pandemic of violence against women. So there is a lot going on in the background. Also, we had COVID-19 as a developing challenge. So the first confirmed case of COVID in Lebanon was during February 2020. The response from the Lebanese government was initially successful. In March 2020, the government closed Beirut Airport for 2 weeks, and there was a curfew implemented between 7 p.m. and 5 a.m. A national lockdown began on the 15th of March until the 24th of May. The lockdown returned during August for 2 weeks, shortly after the Beirut explosion on August 4th, 2020. Between October and November 2020, the government placed nominated towns and villages under lockdown, and by January 2021, the Lebanese health service was on the verge of collapse. The need to administer humanitarian and psychological interventions was significant, but due to curfews and issues with power cuts, these forms of aid needed to be moved online or provided over the telephone. And not only did the researchers have to deal with humanitarian and financial crises in Lebanon, But in early 2021, the UK government made significant cuts to the overseas development assistance expenditure, resulting in the reduction or complete removal of AHRC funding for some ODA projects. So whilst expressive life writing and telling during crisis was allowed to go ahead, the project was given significant cuts in funding. The lack of clarity in the decisions made and the complexity of implementing cuts to the budget meant that many of our UK research hours were spent trying to achieve clarity around the situation and redesigning budgets, something that Siobhan did so much work on. The budget for the projects that we had included 2 joint analysis workshops, which included travel and accommodation, and a small budget allocated to our research partners in Lebanon. In order for our partners in Lebanon to receive the budget, they were required to complete a due diligence declaration supported by documentation pertaining to the economic security of the NGO. The paperwork again took a significant number of research hours and highlighted a number of assumptions and biases within the financial systems within the UK university. The first is that the paperwork was in English and the documentation to support the due diligence was also expected in English. Financial support was not made to pay for any kind of translation. Secondly, the assumption was that the NGO would have access to scanners to upload supported documentation and that the electricity and data would be adequate to send this over. There is an assumption for researchers and those that control spending that electricity and digital access are the norm, but when working internationally in a crisis, particularly a crisis in which funds for research are required before research can begin, these assumptions cannot be made. Prior to our partners' funds being allocated and the research taking place, we needed to provide the NGO with phone top-up cards and provide access to a generator. So the joint analysis workshops. So the first series of joint analysis workshops took place between the 23rd and the 25th of February, and the sessions were held virtually due to the pandemic and the political and economic situation. The draw was to ascertain best practices working in crisis with vulnerable individuals and frontline humanitarian workers assisting those vulnerable individuals. 2 questions related to best working practices during crisis situations were asked of researchers and our partners. Number 1, what are the most effective ways and means of reaching vulnerable subjects isolated by crisis situations? And how can expressive writing and telling be taken to scale as well as part of a well-being centred response to building resilience in the face of crisis? So as you can see here, the first session scheduled Tuesday the 23rd February was held on MS Teams, and translation services were provided by Interactio on call via Teams and the Interactio app. So our initial plan was to host the sessions at A&D's offices with all researchers present and with Lebanese translators present. But as you know, we could not travel overseas and the Lebanese researchers were under curfew. The sessions were timetabled to include a welcome, introduction and key questions, a discussion of ethical practice, a focus group, and a reflection on existing practices, and finally a working group to draft an ethical framework. So the initial plan presented to the funders during the draw was originally scheduled for January in Lebanon. Due to the ongoing pandemic, this was quashed. The move online was suggested, but we felt as a research group that it posed its own practical and ethical problems. These issues were particularly acute regarding the ethnographic aspect of the draw and observation of participants. So a key question raised in response to working in crisis was, how is observation of the joint analysis workshop impacted in the online space? And there's a quote here from Participation Observation, a guide for field workers, which states observation is not just a visual phenomenon, but includes all of the senses. Observation therefore consists of gathering impressions of the surrounding world through all relevant human faculties. And these were really, really limited by our participation in these workshops online, particularly due to limited data, which meant that we were not able to see our co-researchers in Lebanon. So in an ordinary situation or time, the practice of observation would be in person, using arts-based methodologies to understand the practice of the NGOs. But instead, this observation became a situation from which we were gleaning insights into the best practice of our researchers in the field and adapting their best practices for use in our own praxis. So the insights that they had, we then used to kind of develop our own research practices to study the ELW. So the working online had some methodological pressures. MS Teams is great sometimes. It works better through the app rather than a browser, but there are issues with downloading the app, setting up accounts, and depending on the age of the smartphone or computer, this could be problematic. There's also issues of connectivity and the amount of data used. But as a plus point, Teams did give us the opportunity to record the sessions, to transcribe, to show PowerPoints, and to match up translation and Teams recordings and transcriptions. But there are limits to observation and interaction. Non-verbal interactions and facial expressions were not seen. When participants did have their cameras on, we could see into the background of participants, and was this ethical, especially as some of our participants had children. So whilst Teams was useful due to time and risk constraints, it did remove the opportunity for researchers to understand also the group and organisational dynamics in that community of practice in the workshops. It stopped us from seeing the surface structures and deep structures within the NGO. And these structures may stop individuals from speaking up within the group, for example, or there may be individuals that control the conversation, who try to push down ideas, who force bias, or hinder the collection of data. So this was problematic. In Journey to Social Activism, Qualitative Approaches, Joshua Atkinson suggests that observation as part of the ethnographic enterprise focuses on documenting and illuminating these culturally embedded social systems, which on this occasion we were not party to, and this was also affected by the language barrier. So we used On-Call and Interactio, which was a form of simultaneous translation. So this meant that participants had to use a translation app on their mobile phone while simultaneously using Teams. This was difficult as Lebanese Arabic differs slightly from other forms, so finding the right translator was an issue. Some of our co-researchers in Lebanon were able to speak both English and Arabic, and the movement between languages meant that the translators were frequently confused and needed to halt the conversation mid-flow to remind participants to speak in one language. So our recordings were broken up. People frequently lost their train of thought. Also, an issue was that the translators were unable to convey the dynamics of the spoken languages. Ethics of translation and informed consent. So due to the nature of the research, informed consent needed to be attained from everybody, including the translators, as they may have been party to difficult or particularly traumatic material. But due to the nature of translation, how informed was the consent that we were able to provide our co-research partners? So this is something that I've been trying to reflect upon in my own work on this problem. Choice of translated terms as well. Because we are not Lebanese Arabic speakers, we had no guarantee that the terms spoken were translated accurately, particularly if those terms were deemed inappropriate or culturally uncomfortable. So both ways, you know, we were unsure of the terms used, were they correct? There were issues with the telecommunications infrastructure and data availability in Lebanon. Wi-Fi data was costly, bandwidth was narrow and slow, and electricity was rationed. So we were very rarely able to see participants. And if we did, they were obviously at home in their own homes. So recording was a particularly complex issue. Also, the size of PowerPoints. We did send out PowerPoints to participants the night before the sessions, but they were frequently too large to download or to be seen on laptop screens or mobile phone screens. So this is something that we had to quickly adjust to. Images, design elements needed to be removed before sharing. And this also meant that there were issues in showing housekeeping and informed consent slides. So this all needed to be really quickly addressed. Also, the PowerPoints were translated, but again, issues with finding translators fluent in a Lebanese dialect of Arabic. And once the PowerPoints had come to us, the Microsoft would justify the Arabic from the right-hand side to the left-hand side, which altered the meaning of the text. Again, an issue of working in crisis and in a different language. All the way through the joint analysis workshops, we were thinking about risk and developing a risk matrix. Not only did we build matrices for social work staff, but also the research team and for the social work clients. I think some of these are available on Ordo. If anybody wants to take a look, they are up there. So as you can see from the risk matrix, as well as the changes required to work in practices in this period of crisis, our research became iterative. Yet despite providing the research team, both the UK and Lebanese co-researchers with an adaptive praxis, this did lead to some ethical concerns which required continual self-reflexation. There were obvious current pressures on our co-research partners, A&D, and pressures from the COVID-19 pandemic. When combined with the socio-economic climate in Lebanon, as well as the financial impetus to pursue this research, we had to ensure the research was a good use of their time, was safe and ethical, and that there was a continual renegotiation of the enterprise. So we were also due to have a second joint analysis workshop, which we booked for London in the December of that year. Planning began when COVID-19 restrictions were relaxed, but the university still had restrictions in place. Despite really excellent administrative support, the systems such as travel booking and risk assessment lacked agility, and the process was particularly long, arduous, and led to much confusion. During the period preceding the second joint analysis workshop, our co-researchers in Lebanon were living with 1 hour of electricity and 3-day queues for food. And they believed that the risks from travel and the possibility of developing COVID-19 seemed lesser than the risk of undertaking the JAW and research from Lebanon. So they made the choice to travel. Unfortunately, the university decided that the risk from our part was too high and the JAW was cancelled. So by not allowing our co-researchers to make their own decisions pertaining to research in a crisis, I would argue that we are perhaps guilty of suggesting we know best, or the university knows best, and shifting away from a collaborative process to one potentially of imbalance. So my final thoughts on the ethics of collaborative research have been shaped by reflecting on this unique process, which tested the process of thinking or researching together. Co-research, despite its best intentions, has ethical and structural imbalances. Crisis for the UK researchers on the team was definitively not the same as for the Lebanese team. The AHRC ODA funding was cut at the start of the project, which led to anxiety on behalf of UK researchers, and due diligence that was required for the financial transfer for Lebanese project funding led to so many issues that by the time they did get their budget, and the Lebanese currency had collapsed, and it was not worth as much as it should be. And there are some references. And Siobhan, are you coming back?
Very briefly, coming back just to, because I think we've actually overrun, and that's my fault, I do apologize. Thanks, Sally. Maybe just go to the conclusion. Oh no, yes, stay there for a second. Just to say to all of you, despite all those challenges which Sally's outlined, which were really real, we have a number of outputs, including the Expressive Writing Self-Care Toolkit for frontline workers and human rights defenders, which our co-researchers worked with us on. A youth curriculum, which a new strand developed, and which we've worked on with Shift in Tripoli. And there are some potentially useful other items if any of you are working in these kinds of areas. And finally, our ongoing conclusions, because they're not actually conclusions, but I won't read this, but basically, as you can gather, we feel that despite the ethical imbalances that Sally's outlined that we always have to be aware of, it does seem that the tenets of expressive writing and telling can actually help to foster at least a sense of potential equality in the workshop situations that we've been in. And we hope that continuing to work with relational ethic of respect and responsibility, we can look at how knowledge is produced, and as Fisher says, we can learn about research participants' own moral perspectives, thus adding a further dimension. So thank you for listening. I'm sorry to have cut into the questions time, but I think we can probably go to that now.
No worries. Thank you so much, Sally and Siobhan, for that rich detail, not only about the project, but also your very careful thinking of how it adapts and the sort of various challenges and complexity of the process of doing research itself. So thanks so much for that. We've got just under 20 minutes for a bit of a discussion. I see there is a question already in the chat from Jessica Giles. Jessica, would you like to come in and ask your question?
Hi, thanks so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, brilliant presentations. Thank you so much. I know myself from having thought through and put in some bids for projects in countries like Lebanon that it takes a massive amount of resilience and a massive amount of initiative, even when everything is going your way. What I cannot imagine how you did was in lockdown, when we were all faced really with getting through the week, how you not only got through your own weeks, but you had that resilience and that initiative to overcome hurdles which must have occurred every single day in helping those in other countries. And the reason I say that is because I early on in lockdown, I attended a webinar of colleagues from states throughout Africa, and they were communicating things like, well, there is no internet, or even if there is internet, it's really expensive. We can't gather in one place around one phone. You know, we're all in our homes and isolated. You know, I can't reach my students because of this. The government won't do this. And there were these massive issues that even when we think we're the OU and we think we know how to do things, they cannot be done because of the particular barriers that the pandemic threw up. So I'm just in awe of what you did. But I'm really interested to know how you yourselves, if you like, kind of kept that momentum and that initiative going in the face of all that.
Well, Sally, would you want to weigh in there?
I mean,
Thanks,
I think we had the benefit of, you know, having the ability to use kind of Wi-Fi and all the, you know, the technology that the OU has, whereas we were kind of had to, we were in the hands of our co-researchers in Lebanon, and you know, their data, their phone lines were used firstly, and rightly so, for working with their social worker clients. So it was quite a lot of waiting around for us, but that was just the way that things had to be done, and you know, we were grateful that they were willing to take the time to respond to us when they were able to. And a lot of the research was done via the media of WhatsApp and occasionally Facebook, because that was the best way of doing it. As that.
Yeah, I think also, you know, the human element helps you through in those times, doesn't it? We had each other, which was great. I don't think I could have done this without Sally and Meg as well, who's not here today. But also we had the expectations of our co-researchers and the knowledge that what they were facing, even if we were kind of despairing in our own homes during lockdown, what they were facing was just 10 times worse. And in a way, they were so inspiring. I think we were constantly re-inspired by them. Thank you for the question, though.
Are there any questions on the floor? You're welcome to use the raise hand function as well. Otherwise, I have a question, if I may. It's about the policy, the use of your research in policy adaptation. Siobhan mentioned already that a lot of this has actually fed into changes in policy. I'd like to hear a bit more about that. I mean, as an economist that has done some policy work, I do aware of the sort of obsession policymakers on sort of hard numbers, and it's really wonderful to see somewhere unlike the UNDP, as you mentioned, being interested in qualitative material, data, if you will, that really does show up the complexity of real socioeconomic impact. So I just wanted to ask you a bit more, both questions about the actual adaptation you saw and how that fed into that, as well as how you think the UNDP is going to be able to sort of develop this to sort of bring qualitative research to, you know, on a par, really, if not even more important than quantitative research in certain contexts and situations.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question. I mean, we were surprised that UNDP were remotely interested in story gathering, or even in understanding what that meant. And I think we were helped by the people, as it always happens, the individuals on the ground. At the time, it was Iraq, where there was this support for integrated reconciliation group, who understood that nothing is ahistorical and nothing happens, everything happens somewhere, actually, to use a creative writing phrase. So they realized that integration, like, is just an aspiration. What actually we need to do is actually hear what is happening for people, what is going on for you in your actual everyday life. And that was refreshing to us. We as I say, we were surprised. And I think it probably came from an almost, you know, how difficult the problem was. What we discovered was that the person, our interlocutor at UNDP, was actually also working for the Ministry of Internal Affairs. That initially I felt quite blindsided by, and I thought, oh gosh, what are the ethical implications of this? But in actual fact, it worked out to work in our favor. That doesn't mean it was entirely ethical at the same time. So, but it did seem to work in our favor because she immediately understood how, as you say, the qualitative could feed into policy. In other words, how decisions eventually made about rolling out mitigations and helps and supports could be informed by those individual stories, you know. But I mean, in an ongoing way, I'm not sure. I think in better times, people will revert back to the quantitative. I think it was almost, you know, because of the nature of the crisis that the qualitative came into the picture. But I love your question. I don't know if you want to add anything there, Sally. Okay. Well, there's also a question Lorna Mundy's asking here in the chat about what reflections we have on ways of attending ongoingly, I love that, to power relations between institutions, funders, global North workers and global South workers. Absolutely. Sally, do you want to begin on that one? I mean, you are, that's what you're currently in a way considering almost, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is the question, isn't it? And I don't think that you know there is a disparity between the power relations in any kind of research in which one half of the research partnership is potentially the study of the other half of the research partnership. I mean, personally, I think there is a lot to be said about including partners, especially in the case of our A&D partners, as co-writers or co-researchers on any kind of papers or any kind of outputs that we produce. I think that is something that should be recognised going forward. Yeah, Siobhan, have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I too think that's the you know, $6 million question, and I think the way you've actually phrased the question implies part of the answer, which is attending ongoingly. In other words, understanding that relational ethics are part of the situation. We do find Celia Fisher useful on this, which was in the references. So she discusses the justice care idea, which effectively is a way of talking about what you're asking in a way there. But the actual fact of the matter remains that in any funded work, there are expectations, there are demands, and there are constraints, and that they're not always ones you can get around. And they do invade the space, they invade the mind space problematically, and as Sally has indicated to some extent, they can be that can be very detrimental, really, on all sorts of fronts. But I do think an attentive, ongoing relationality or understanding of relationality does help to mitigate.
Yeah, and maintaining those relationships even when the research isn't being done, I think, is also important. Like Siobhan has had a relationship with A&D for a long time. Their working relationship and relationship is long standing, and it's something that is not just there when, you know, we need information from them. It's something that is ongoing, and it's a mutual kind of respect for the work each is doing. And I think that's also important.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, you know, the way funders, like they'll do a call and you have to scramble to get it in for the deadline. And then they say, right, you got it, but you have to spend it by this deadline. And you're thinking that is not how actual research should work or actually works. So I'm sure like all of you listening who've done funded research, what you've got to do is, you know, you do all your conceptualization before the call, and then you try and mally it to the call, because you know there is a call likely to come, and you've actually put in place a lot of the pre-work with your partners before you start funding anything, because you have to, because you couldn't possibly do it as quickly as they want. So yeah, the ongoing relationships, as Sally points out, and in a way the long-term ongoing relationships are what make this kind of work possible, I think.
Thanks for that. We still have a few minutes left if anyone had any sort of other questions or comments that they wanted to make. Otherwise, I do have another question. I don't know if it's more about sort of, I mean, you're both from sort of the creative writing and English literature kind of disciplines, and I wondered, you know, how you approach sort of interdisciplinarity in your work as well, because this is clearly extremely interdisciplinary, and I just wondered if you could reflect a bit on how you did that and whether you needed to collaborate with others.
Yes, we always do need to collaborate with others. Just as a for instance, Dr. Zoe Walkington of psychology at the OU has been a great friend to this project, a critical friend. She has looked at the new curriculum for adolescents and youth and made extremely valuable indicators and remarks on that. The kind of expertise in our collaborating partners was astounding, really. The social workers, that's just a name for what for that group, but among that group there was psychologists, policy analysts, if you like. Nadine Saba, who's the director, is a lawyer. So the amount of expertise that that group were bringing to the table was just extraordinary. And I think that's really why the joint analysis workshops worked so well, because they were actually interdisciplinary. And even though it wasn't something we were reflecting on at the time, I think it's maybe something we could reflect on more. And Sally, you may have stuff to add to that.
No, but also as well, kind of the research also uses kind of qualitative and quantitative methods, arts research methodologies, so kind of sociological background. So it is a kind of an amalgamation of many diverse and different disciplines from many diverse and different researchers, including those from the Lebanese A&D.
Yeah, one phrase that I have found useful, and I think I'm adopting it more widely now, is social literary practice, because the word social obviously implies a certain approach to it. Literary allows in the arts and humanities, and but then practice is key, because that's what we do. We practice, you know. And you know, it'd be interesting to me if we have listeners with us today, maybe like yourself, Susan, coming from economics, who don't initially or it doesn't immediately seem obvious how arts and humanities can actually have a role. So if we've done anything today, hopefully it's to say, look, come and talk to us, because we're very open, as you can see, and we're really interested in collaborating with other disciplines and valuing what, you know, other disciplines bring, you know. So the more the better. So
That's wonderful, Siobhan and Sally. I will certainly be reaching out to you with many more questions and and suggest, well, I would like to hear your suggestions on this kind of collaboration. So I think we're running towards the end of time, our allocation of time. So I just want to thank our speakers, Siobhan and Sally again. And thank you very much for sharing this extremely rich work with us. And to remind everyone that this is a monthly seminar series. So there will be another seminar next month. I don't have the details with me at the moment, but I think Heidi may have those to share in the chat. Otherwise, look out in your inboxes for details of the next seminar. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again, Sally and Siobhan. Thanks, Heidi, for all your support as well.